This video shows an excerpt from my most recent astrology class last Sunday on Patreon. In it, I talk about the current situation with Justice Clarence Thomas, and I briefly mention his wife, Ginny Thomas, as well. At the time of the class, Thomas had been implicated in a failure to report numerous gifts and perks given to him over the course of many a year by a well-known billionaire Texan Harlan Crow, likewise well known as a Republican supporter. By now, we also know that Thomas failed to report real estate benefits through transactions with the same billionaire. Although it is true that we can say this conduct by a Supreme Court judge appears to be at minimum unethical and at worst completely corrupt, my sense is that the odds are still low that he will get in any kind of significant hot water as a result. Nevertheless, you will see and hear me say that his astrology is pointing to something that is potentially a lot more dangerous during a period spanning from now and into the next several years. I'm first going to talk a little bit about the chart for Clarence Thomas, just because he's in the news recently and there seems to be a lot of interest in this in regard to what might happen, etc. But also because it illustrates this aspect, the 150. And this is, as I've said before, I think a number of times in different classes, the 150, to my mind, is one of the most underestimated aspects because it's not a regular, in quotes, type aspect, in that the regular ones are more symmetrical. So if you go from Aries to Capricorn or to Cancer, you get square. If you go opposite, you get to Libra, you get an opposition. And you can then get sextiles are Aquarius to Aries, so like 2 signs over. If you go 3 signs in between, you get trines, and you link them through elements, Aries, Leo, Sagittarius. So those are symmetrical, and they're, in a sense, easier to see, and you could even say geometrically more appealing as well. And of course, there's no question that the main aspects are, of course, really important. It's just that this one is as well, and probably because it's not symmetrical and because it links the natural first sign to the 8th and the 6th, makes it a complicated and often very problematic angle, since the 6th is health and the 8th is death, or aspects of health that are quite dangerous, such as infections, surgeries, although surgeries, agreed that you could say they're a blessing in the sense that they can bring about important repairs. But generally speaking, surgery would have to be placed on the, maybe not negative, but definitely on the downside of things. So the 8th is a difficult house. The 6th, definitely, especially in this context, when you put it at 150 to the ascendant, which is its natural place. And so when you look at the chart for Clarence Thomas, what you see shown there in the dotted lines, those are 150s natally, as in the moon. His moon at early Aquarius is in a 150 to this cluster of planets in Cancer. And keeping in mind especially that he is a Cancer. And so if a person is Cancer, then the sun in Cancer is ruled by the moon. So the moon acquires extra importance in this chart, and it's in 150 to the sun, thereby invoking, bringing in, or correlating with the energy of the 6th and 8th houses, the 150. The other one that I drew here is a transiting 150, meaning the Uranus this year. You can see it over here in this ephemeris. It's roaming around the 22nd, 23rd degree of Taurus, thereby putting it in a 150 to his natal Jupiter, which of course immediately links it to health in his chart as well by transit, because Uranus is resident in the health house at birth, therefore channels that energy. Jupiter's in the other health house, the 12th, in fact arguably the bigger health house, the more complicated health house. And so Uranus is transiting to Jupiter in that angle, and moreover brings the opposition that it has at birth, suggesting stress, and channels it through the 150. This has to be considered a potentially dangerous transit. But to make matters worse for Thomas is the Pluto cycle. You see it here in early Aquarius, although, of course, it is yet to return to Capricorn a couple more times. For that, you check your ephemeris and you see that in 2023, it spends quite a few months in very late Capricorn still. Then it makes a pretty full entry into Aquarius next year, because it'll cover 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 8 out of the 12 months it's in Aquarius. And then by 2025 it's fully in Aquarius. But what is significant is that when it does that, it enters into the 150, because it'll start to conjoin the moon and do a 150 to these planets. And that extends, you see here how it's drawn spring of 23 with a line, and then all the way to the fall of 26. That's a very big swath of time. And then you start to look around and you realize that Pluto comes from the 8th at birth, immediately making it a dangerous planet in that sense. Being next to Saturn is no particular help, of course. So it circulates the energy of the 8th as it goes around. You can see how slow Pluto moves, but you also know that in this type of aspect, it can become extremely dangerous. You also know that recently it crossed the ascendant and he experienced a lot of health problems. And this would be correlated with its natal position in Leo in the 8th sign. And now you know that it's moving further and it's going to trigger this 150 situation. Curiously, where Neptune on the high end is the most spiritual planet, you notice that in his chart it's elevated and it squares his Venus, Mercury, Sun. And moreover, you see over here that at birth it was 2.8 days from a station. This planet is very, very strong. But to my mind, this man is both corrupt and deceitful. He's showing you the downside of Neptune for sure. Now, I of course, I'm aware that if someone is tilting conservative, definitely they tilt MAGA, they're going to disagree with me completely. I stand by my assessment that he is corrupting the Neptune energy, just like Trump corrupts it, perhaps even more. And so that is the stamp on his character, rather than pointing to some kind of spiritual approach, which you could even say would be the case with Jupiter being in the 12th. He's not doing that. He's doing something entirely different. And now, the other thing to keep in mind is that Saturn is in Pisces at the moment. Now, this also illustrates very clearly a rule that I've brought up in the past, where you look at planets in their birth condition and they bring that energy as they circulate in transit. And so Saturn is here at birth. It circulated twice, 2 returns, and now it's moved all the way around and it's reached the early degrees of Pisces. And you know that he recently ran into some serious problems when his acceptance of gifts from people in high places, his avoiding reporting it and so forth. In other words, it has a quality of scandal, and it has a quality of, pretty obviously negative energy. I'm sure he's not liking what's happening. And yet you say, well, how does this work? I mean, Saturn in early Pisces trines his Sun, Mercury, Venus. It's trine right now. It's trine his Venus. Venus rules his 10th. His 10th is reputation. His 11th too, because the MC goes through there. So you'd think, what's the problem? The problem is that Saturn, first of all, is in the 8th, but also is in semi-square to these planets. The semi-square is at 4 degrees, 29 minutes. These planets are at 2.5, 3 and a quarter. They're moving toward completing the semi-square because Saturn moves slower, so the motion is semi-square for sure. And so the Saturn transmits the semi-square energy as it travels, and the trine becomes a problem, even though it should be an easy aspect. So Saturn in Pisces there in no way is helpful to him. I mean, then you can look forward and say, as it moves beyond the trine, it's going to eventually, as in next year here, will oppose Mars. It's moving toward that. Mars connects to his 11th by the 11th by rulership, and the MC is there. And so in a chart like this, the 10th and the 11th are heavily involved in reputation, which would be the case almost always because the 10th and 11th are that way. But when the MC crosses through the 11th, even more so. So to me, in conclusion, what I would say about this chart would be that irrespective of whether he actually gets in trouble in a significant way for what he's done, and well, I think that's possible because of the separation of powers and how insulated the Supreme Court is and how incredibly partisan and at times quite corrupt they've become. I'm not sure they're going to do anything about it, but maybe life will do something about it, because to me, this guy, as we move toward 2025, given that by 2025, 2026, the Pluto, you see it here, is still active, but Saturn by then will have entered Aries, and already in the early part of Aries, it squares these planets. This, to me, is not looking good at all, and so odds are pretty good that he would have to perhaps leave the court on account of his health, or worse, based on the way these transits are moving in his chart. And you can look also at the progressions for more information, in that here, Taurus rising, he started out with Capricorn rising, but as his life has moved forward, right now it's in Taurus. Therefore, with Taurus rising, you point to Venus as the planet that is most important in the progression. And in that sense, the progressed Venus is dealing with the Pluto opposition still now, because if you look back here, Pluto all through 2024 is still, or 2023, pardon me, is still in Capricorn opposing that Venus, and even to some extent in here in 24. So it's definitely working that particular angle, and that can't be good either, because the Venus in his natal chart, as I said, is Libra, reputation, and in this chart is the first sign, which is always very critical, and the Venus secondarily or primarily, whichever way you want to put it, first Libra here, so it's the health in the progressed chart. And the other thing, of course, is that the Pluto transit, which is up here in early Aquarius, is moving toward squaring Mars as we go into especially 25, 26, is going to be squaring this Mars. Mars will move forward a little bit, but not enough to get it away from the transiting Pluto. By then, of course, the progressed moon will have long left, and so it won't be a factor, but the Mars will definitely be a factor. And so that's another issue from the progressed positions as well. And even though this chart, I obviously look at it second, it's remarkable to me how many times I see energy both in the chart itself, all by itself, not just in its alignment with the natal, and that is the first level you always do. You always look at these planets and see what they're doing in the natal situation. But even so, the progressed chart by itself can be very, very meaningful in describing a situation. And so in that sense too, he's in these years where the progressed Sun is going to be opposed by Saturn. That happens more next year rather than this year. But definitely, I would not consider these progressions all that helpful in the context of what he's dealing with right now. And then what I would also add here is that, well, a couple of things. One is, if we look at his solar arcs, the main thing that jumped out at me there is with a 25 Capricorn rising, the solar arc Pluto is currently right at the zenith point, which means it squares the ascendant and descendant. And that's pretty threatening, again, because the Pluto comes from the 8th house, but it's also the kind of solar arc you might see when a person has run into a big problem on the level of reputation, because it puts it up above here in at the zenith of the natal chart. And further information to add to this would be that if we then take Ginny Thomas into account, and of course, with her I don't have a time, her moon is somewhere between 24 degrees Sagittarius and 618 of Capricorn. And of course there you'd say, to the extent that it's on this side, meaning she was born from 0 a.m. to 12 noon, 12 noon would be 0 Capricorn 16, what I've drawn here. To the extent that she's in the first half of the day, the more she is in near-term trouble in that the Neptune is squaring these degrees during these years of her life. There you go to this, to the ephemeris again, and you see that Neptune is going through Pisces here. It doesn't get into Aries until 2026. So until then, potentially, this moon could be in trouble. But what is more obvious that is happening for sure is Uranus is in Taurus over here, squaring the Venus, and it'll do that all of 2023, and so that's a challenge. And then probably the worst is she's born on a Saturn Sun square. I mean, it's 5 to, it's about 8 and a bit degrees, but that definitely still counts. And the Saturn at the moment is transiting through the Sun, and in fact you would argue that because the Sun is 5 degrees, so looking over here you see that Saturn reaches the 5th degree by about May, but then from then you read it on that degree until it gets out, so it backtracks, but goes through that degree again late January next year. So there's quite a swath of time when it's challenging the Sun directly, and things don't get better beyond those degrees either, because then Saturn gets pulled in. Like when you're looking at a Saturn Sun square, you would say the action pressure on this Sun Saturn square is any planet transiting from from 5 to 13.5, but really you would say 4 or even 3 to about 15, 16. That whole swath is either hitting the Sun or Saturn, therefore involving them both. And so there is plenty of runway here for her to get extremely uncomfortable based on the way the situation is going. And moreover, you always look at, especially in a woman's chart, the solar energy often implicates the important male in her life, and so you can read it that way as well. Pressure on the male energy, meaning Clarence Thomas, but that can mean anything, by the way. Pressure is, already it's pretty obvious. There's a pressure on account of the way the situation is developed, but it can also be more problematic pressure involving health.